tell, you cannot determine, reason cannot determine when such an enlightenment experience occurs. He calls it a gift of God. He calls it something that's ready and ripe. In the Greek, it's called the sudden. Suddenly the experience occurs. Nothing that seems to be its primary cause is operating. Therefore, for Carl Jung, he says that's the will of God. That's a gift. Gift of God. In Plato, especially, you can see it in several places. One of the great places in the Symposium, where he talks about the overwhelming vision of beauty itself, and he says, suddenly you behold a wondrous vision. Suddenly. It's always suddenly. And the third hypothesis, it's suddenly. It's the major concept in Plato. That is, since you can't anticipate it, there's nothing you can do in order to reach it. You have to just let go of everything and wait for the fruit. When it's ripe enough, it drops of its own accord, which is, of course, a Zen and Chinese Chan notion. Now, what is this enlightenment, according to Carl Jung? It's the lumina naturae. That's this, the divine luminosity, right out of Plato, the most brilliant light of being. How do you do it? He says, well, there are many, he goes through several ways of describing it. But he says the primary thing is, if you want to have a vision of the good or the one itself, you have to become one yourself. Now, in Plato's Republic, there's the whole whole exploration of the nature of justice. And it goes on, seeking out if you can describe it and what brings it about, whether you can have a vision of this. Is this another idea like beauty itself, justice itself? And so therefore, he finally comes to a point where he then describes what it is. And I'd just like to read you just one line for now, it's a long paragraph, so I don't know whether I should read the whole thing, but I'll cut it back. But in truth, just as it appears, was something like this. Not, however, in a man's outward practice, but inwardly. And truly he must do his own business in himself. He must have pulled all three parts in tune with him, highest, lowest, middle, exactly like the three chief notes of a scale, and any other intervals between these that there may be. He must have bound all these together and made himself completely one out of many. Temperate, concordant, and then only do whatever he does, getting wealth, care of the body, or even matters of state and private contract. What must he do? He must have bound these together and made himself completely one out of many. That's the key concept in preparing for an experience of justice itself. That's becoming one itself. That's also, as we'll see later, one of the key points in alchemy. It comes right out of Plato. Now, he is now going to say, how do you do it? How do you get this enlightenment? Well, he says, rather curiously, he says, you know what you have to do? You have to study the words of the philosophers. And therefore, in these alchemical works, they're quoting philosophers. And in the quotes, they're telling you how to do this curious thing called philosophy. Then he ends with one of the really great names in philosophy, Parmenides. Now, why is that important? Because, see, Socrates considers everybody around him, and he compares them and talks about all the philosophers, but he says there's only one that truly is the greatest. It stands in great reverence before him. That's the man called Parmenides. He is really the father of the non-dual in Western philosophy. And Plato did a dialogue called the Parmenides, where he attributes to him a whole splendid system of thought. Now, this There's a question about whether this is the same Parmenides, but it has some of the same themes in it from the alchemists. Now, how do you do it? According to do it, you need three things: imagination, meditation, and theory, according to Carl Jung. Now, imagination is the key to it all. Meditation is the source. What does he mean by meditation in this great work called Alchemy? He says meditation is when you enter into a dialogue with yourself. That's the key. You enter into a dialogue with yourself repeatedly. He said that does is wake you up. You're talking to yourself. Finally, you're then becoming attentive to some interesting voice that's very profound within yourself. He said that's meditation. Becoming devoted to that, going towards it, becoming more and more involved in this inner dialogue, that's the method. He said, but to do it, he says, you have to be in an interesting state. He says you have to be able to be physically strong and intellectually alert, but psychologically prepared for it. He said because this process takes sooner or later a concentration of the life force. And he uses this Latin expression, the anima corporalis, right? Corporalis, corporeal, the soul, the physical soul. Now, what is that in Carl Jung? He says, you know what it is? He says, there is, in man, there's the diaphragm. He said, below the diaphragm is a center of power. You have to waken that up. And you have to, therefore, utilize the physical and the psychic forces in man to sustain this concentrated life force in your meditation. Because there are going to be times when you're up and down and sluggish. Doesn't matter, sit anyhow. Do your inner dialogue. In Japanese Zen Buddhism, that's called the hara. Sometimes called the ki. That's the, in Tantra, that's one of the great chakras. Carl Jung calls it the anima corporis. That's the part where you have to arouse that inner force within you to sustain your meditation. Now look here, he says, you can't do anything without imagination. You see, because you're imagining, you're talking to yourself, you got to maintain that over a long period of time. He said, you know what you do? You have to become attentive to dreams. That's what you need to do, Carl Jung says. Now, how do you treat dreams? He says, well, you have to treat dreams in three ways. You have to expand it, amplify it. You have to allow the dreamer enough room so that they can add to it, so that they can then add their associations to it. And you have to allow them to enter into analogies with whatever it is they're suggesting that comes through their dreams. He calls this theory, theoria. Why? Because you want to awaken that higher part of the mind called the nous, where we get the word noetic. Now, that's especially significant because that's the particular power of the mind. That's the intuitive vehicle through which you can gain the enlightenment into the divine. That's the part of the soul. Now look here, in order for man to do that, that means in some way there's a part of us, right? There's a part of us which is in some way akin to the divine. Carl Jung says, according to the alchemists, the soul of man is not entirely contained in the body. The higher part of it is in the divine. That allows, therefore, nous to operate. Now, this is a splendid notion. It's a Platonic notion. Plotinus expresses it at some length. Now, in all of Plato, all of the dialogues and all of the reflections in Plato, there's only one place